Welcome to Hello Therapy, a podcast to help you take charge of your mental health through evidence-based psychological tips and tools straight from the therapy room so that you can live life better. Experiencing emotional neglect in your childhood can have a profound impact on your life. And in this episode, we're exploring what this might look like for someone and how to navigate this as an adult. I am joined by trauma therapist Shelley Bradley-Scholey. Shelley is a trauma therapist, an accredited EMDR consultant and training facilitator, accredited CBT therapist, and registered mental health nurse. Shelley is the founder of Fortitude Psychological Therapy, an independent therapy practice offering therapy, supervision, and teaching for people who want to learn how to navigate trauma. In this episode, we delve into the challenge of recognizing the signs of emotional neglect and how unmet emotional needs in childhood can affect our relationships, the view of ourselves, and of course, our mental health. We discuss the importance of self-compassion, and Shelley provides some practical tips for healing, including emphasizing the significance of creating space for self-care and the journey towards recovery. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Hello Therapy podcast. I'm so pleased that you're here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So today we're going to talk about childhood emotional neglect. So a bit of a heavy subject, but it's a subject that I come across all the time in my work with clients, and I'm sure you do too. So I think it's a really important topic to talk about. But before we get into all of that, do you want to tell our listeners who you are and what you do?
So my name's Shelley. I'm a trauma therapist. So I work mainly with cognitive behaviour therapy and EMDR therapies. I work in private practice and I have several teaching and training roles. And I'm just really fascinated by everything trauma.
Brilliant. So let's get into it then. Can you tell us first, what do we mean by childhood emotional neglect?
I think in some ways it can feel like harder to define than overtly traumatic experiences, right? Because emotional neglect is really about the absence of something. So, for example, what that might look like is somebody has a childhood experience where their emotional needs weren't met.
Right.
So they might express or experience difficult emotions and that isn't responded to, or it's not responded to in like an appropriate way that would help them to learn how to manage their emotions.
Yeah.
It can look like an absence of emotional support. It could look like being, I suppose, parented in a way that's perhaps quite dismissive or harsh. And I think for people who have experienced childhood emotional neglect, they might kind of had experiences where maybe they were told they were too much or too sensitive, or they might have experiences where they've been ignored, or perhaps like some people have described to me before, if they've had really strong emotions, which is normal for a child, right?
Yeah.
Like I have 2 children, there's big feelings involved. If they've expressed their emotions or they've expressed what they want or what they need, then they just get the silent treatment. Like that element of stuff is just not engaged with, you know. But I think it's harder to define because everybody's experience is like so individual.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really overt and obvious, and other times it's quite subtle. You know, those sort of regular experiences of being quite invalidated or told that your feelings don't really matter or that they don't count or something like that.
I've heard people talking about it in terms of active versus passive emotional neglect. So the more passive emotional neglect might be the not asking about their child's emotions or needs or preferences, and something more active would be, you know, criticizing, for example. I guess the stuff that you could see more if you were an observer. I quite like that definition because I get a lot of people coming to me over the years. A lot of people once you start talking about their childhood, they will start off saying, I had a good childhood. And then when you start exploring, actually it transpires there was some emotional neglect or some experiences that were, less than ideal from a parenting perspective. Have you found that in your work?
I definitely relate to what you're saying about this idea that, oh, yeah, my childhood was normal. It was all fine. I'm not sure what we class as normal, but I think we all have this kind of, not us as therapists, but just us as human beings have this idea of like the absence of physical abuse, the absence of any sexual abuse means that childhood was okay.
Yeah.
And then when we start to explore perhaps like the climate of the household, the mood of the household, what happened at meal times, what happened when you were sad, what happened when you were angry, then I think we can really start to understand somebody's experience in much more depth. And I guess like lots of people are quite familiar now with the concept of ACEs, like these adverse childhood events. Like I think that's quite well understood now. So I think there is, knowledge around these things that can happen to children and the impact that that might have. Whereas I think that emotional neglect isn't quite so well and widely understood, perhaps.
Well, I think what gets talked about the most is emotional abuse, but not necessarily neglect. I think, as you say, like most people have heard that term before. But I was reflecting on when you were talking there about like generationally, I wonder if it's different. The generations coming through now are much more aware of ACEs and emotional abuse, etc. But older generations, boomers, Gen Xers, might not have the same awareness that their childhoods perhaps did contain these elements.
Yeah, definitely. I've just been like recently did a blog about this kind of generational element of trauma and how some of the patterns that we learn kind of get passed down.
Yeah.
So patterns of parenting, patterns of how to respond to somebody's emotions, they kind of get handed down. And often if we don't sort of stop and tune in to what we're saying and how we're acting, we can just like repeat these things, not with malice, just because that's how it was done and therefore that's how it will be done. You can see that in just thinking about like differences in gender, like if I think about perhaps older generations of parents and some of the experiences that my clients have told me about, that my friends have told me about, this idea of like, little boys shouldn't be crying and, stop crying like a baby. And it's not really meant with malice, but then that approach kind of gets like passed down, and then that's just the mentality. And of course, then what you've got there is a little boy who doesn't really learn that his emotions are valid, doesn't really learn what to do, and he's upset, and then he carries that forward in his own life.
And what would you say are the consequences of having had a childhood where there was emotional neglect? What consequences in terms of mental health might we see, do you think?
So one of the key places, I guess, you can see like the ramifications of that is in somebody's emotional development.
Yeah.
So how we experience our emotions, how we then express our emotions, how we respond to other people's emotions. Like you can really see it, I think, in that context. And I guess that is that kind of that passing down of the responses. But you can see it in other places too. So like we might see it in how we act, like particular types of behaviors. So I think as a therapist, you can see it a lot in people's help seeking behaviors, like how they go about gaining help, how people respond to the offer of help. Also how perhaps sometimes that can feel a bit push-pull. Like some people, they want help and then you offer it and that feels quite uncomfortable, quite alien. So then they pull back a little bit. I think you can see it in how we like our view of ourselves. Like I believe that we internalize other people's views of us, particularly when they're important people in our lives, like caregivers and siblings. So if somebody's had an experience of perhaps being ignored or invalidated, they then assume that view of themselves, that they're not important or how they feel doesn't matter. And for somebody who has a belief that how they feel doesn't matter, you might then see lots of things that they do, how they act, that is representative of that. Like not meeting their own needs, like really ignoring what they need and how they feel, putting what other people want and need before themselves. There's lots of terms around this, isn't there? Like people pleasing and being a rescuer and that kind of thing. What else? I mean, gosh, like relationships. I think that's another key place where this stuff kind of shows up, actually, because I guess in relationship, how we manage our own emotions and how we respond to other people, that's really under the spotlight in a relationship, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so how we behave in those situations can then have the knock-on ripple effect on the nature of that relationship and how, you communicate and stuff. I think it just shows up in so many different places for people. Something I saw a lot of when I was working in the military, right, was this like real hyper independence. Like there's no need to rely on other people. Like it's just me, I'm on my own, that's it. And I think that again is another one of the fallouts from this kind of childhood experience.
And it really speaks to that point earlier that you made around, receiving love, receiving care, and how difficult that can feel for someone who has never received love or care in a consistent way. So I think the other point that's in my mind is it's not necessarily that you may have had a childhood where, your whole childhood was about emotional neglect from your parents. Most often what I see is that actually there have been periods of time where, people have been parented extremely well from an emotional standpoint, but there are these kind of moments of time where it hasn't been consistent. And I think that can be really damaging, can't it, for someone? They've experienced the love and the attention and the care that they need as a child, and then it's not there suddenly.
Yeah, absolutely. The lack of consistency, I think, is as damaging as a sort of consistently having no attention paid at all. Because what that does is it impacts a child's sense of safety, their perception of like how reliable the caregivers are. And that sort of uncertainty and unpredictability can create real challenges around people developing a sort of sense of like safeness and trust when they're in relationship with other people.
And I'm wondering whether there are parents listening to this thinking, oh my goodness, I am not consistent in my care to my children because, life is stressful and it's really full on. What would you say to those parents who are sort of slightly panicking about what we're saying?
I'm one of them, right? Like you cannot deny that stuff happen. Like, as we go through our life, we go through these different seasons, don't we? And various things go on around us, like, stress at work, stress with finance, stress in relationships, losses. There's so much stuff that happens to us as human beings, and that impacts our ability to be emotionally available to the people around us. All is not lost. Thankfully, there's neuroplasticity, which is like the safety net for all of us out there who are thinking, oh my goodness, I totally messed this bit up. What am I going to do? The good news is that we can relearn things. And I think that's like, it's so important for people who are in a situation where they have small children or teenagers or whatever. And they're now thinking about all the times that maybe they got it a bit wrong. But it's also helpful for people who've experienced this and are thinking, oh, so I had this experience. It's left me with all these problems. Now what?
Yeah.
You know, we can learn and we can relearn. And I think for people who are in a parenting season now, there is so much value in the concept of like rupture and repair.
Yeah.
So, like, we're not always the best version of ourselves. I'm not always the best version of myself. I think as a therapist, you're constantly thinking, oh my gosh, you know, is this what they're going to be talking about in therapy in 20
Yeah.
years' time? But rupture and repair is this idea that we can get it wrong. Things go awry. Sometimes there's conflict. Sometimes we're dismissive. Sometimes, you know, we do these things because
Yeah.
we're a human, but we can repair these things. I think that's like the most important thing. So if, you know, if there's a situation where somebody perhaps is overtly damaging, like they say something that is unhelpful, hurtful, distressing, or if they just behave in a way that's quite dismissive and invalidating, we can still go back and repair that. And that process through which we can say, you know what, I said this, did this, didn't do this, and I think it was because of this. And I'm really sorry about that. And I wonder how that made you feel. And that repair is so important. I think it's almost better to be able to demonstrate that, like mistake making and repairing it, rather than being perfect from the get go. Because I imagine that's probably quite hard for people to experience too.
If we think about childhood emotional neglect as a concept, like there's always going to be a spectrum of experiences, isn't there, where there are people in the world, unfortunately, that is all of their childhood. But then you have people in the middle and up the other end where it's sort of, there are moments of you know, being invalidated or dismissed, or a parent was going through a tough time for a while. And I think in therapy, it's really about understanding the context, isn't it, as well, and helping clients understand the context. What would you say about healing from childhood emotional neglect? So again, if there's someone listening, you know, who knows that that's what their childhood was like, they're really feeling the effects from it, maybe there's difficulties in their relationships, what would you say about this idea of healing?
So I think healing's a bit of a journey, right? Even though I've worked in various roles where we've had these like real small windows of time to do therapeutic work. And I think therapy is like one part of that journey, but it's not all of it. I think recovering from a childhood that's had difficulties for whatever reason is like, it's a whole thing. You know, and I think it requires work. It requires work and maintenance and kind of revisiting. I think for lots of people, coming to recognize the stories around why they have the difficulties they have, like understanding that it's always about kind of what's happened to you. I suppose seating it in a context of somebody's bigger story is really important. Being able to kind of understand and recognize that, gosh, no wonder I feel like this when my partner ignores me because of what happened. Like that, reaching that understanding is so important for people. I think that process in itself, I think, is quite validating.
Yeah.
But then knowing it alone isn't enough. I think there has to be more that then happens. For example, I think particularly around emotional neglect, there's something about being able to learn to recognize your own needs.
Yeah.
So when they haven't been met, and that might have been a pattern that somebody's become accustomed to, there's a bit of relearning really that needs to happen around recognizing, tuning into what you need and how to then make that happen for yourself.
The barrier to that can often be, well, I don't deserve it, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I use a lot of self-compassion in my work and helping people find that part of themselves that can be the part that says, what do you need? How can I get that for myself? But the I don't deserve it because I'm this or I'm that could be so strong, can't it?
Yeah. Yeah. It really gets in the way, doesn't it?
Really does.
You know, and this remarkable thing where we have the ability to see ourselves as in some way different to everybody else.
Yeah.
So people might readily be able to like access compassion for other people, you know. So I can see very clearly, like, oh, my husband's had a really tough day and he's really tired and he needs some food and some rest and to take it easy. But when it comes to myself, there's like this inner dialogue of like, must do this and must do that. And
Yeah.
you've got to earn that rest.
Yeah.
And I think there's sometimes as well, when it comes to compassion, there can be lots of misconceptions about what that actually means.
Yeah.
You know? And I think I probably had some of those misconceptions. I recall doing the compassionate mind module of some training quite a long time ago, thinking, oh gosh, I just don't have time for this. I've got too much to do.
Yeah.
And they were making me sit and breathe. And I was thinking, oh, come on.
Yeah.
You know? And I think there's misconception that it's like not a good use of time, that it's a bit fluffy.
Yeah.
But actually, it was we had a wonderful speaker who I later went on to work with at some point in my career, who basically said to me, Shelley, compassion is the sensible option. And as soon as you realize that, you'll really be able to embed it into your life and your practice and everything. So
Yeah.
I've always hung on to that actually, of course, it makes sense.
I find myself saying a lot in my therapy room to people, how do you know how to look after yourself if you haven't been looked after? And that can sometimes really help shift someone's perspective on, oh, okay, it's not my fault that I can't be self-compassionate, or I can't look after myself, or I have a blind spot around my needs. Oh, it's because of X, Y, and Z in my past. And as you said before, that having that understanding for yourself is so key.
And looking at the discrepancy between what we might offer to somebody else versus what we might offer to ourselves.
Yeah.
You know, I think that gap can tell us a lot about which needs we've learned to suppress and perhaps what needs weren't met.
Yeah.
I think compassion is like an antidote to so much stuff, you know, when we feel critical or guilty or ashamed. I think compassion is like the antidote to lots of those things.
Absolutely. So would you say that in terms of if someone's looking for therapy, for example, if someone's, recognize, okay, I need a bit of help with this, would you advocate a particular type of therapy? Would you say actually compassion focused therapy is where it's at, or are there other types of therapies that would help?
I think that over lots of years now working with trauma, I've come to kind of recognize that in order for people to really move forward from trauma in a way that has longevity, we must work on filling in the gaps that are there. So whatever somebody's unmet needs are, whether that's information, understanding, emotional needs meeting, like skills to manage difficult feelings, like before you can work on the trauma, you need to kind of fill some of those gaps. I think I've learned over the years that jumping in to solely work on trauma when there are significant gaps there leads to people getting quite stuck in trauma therapy. And what can happen is they're left feeling like, oh, I was told this therapy is amazing, it's life-changing, but it hasn't worked for me.
Yeah.
Like I'm not fixable. It's important, I think, to work in a way that accounts for that bigger picture, like what's missing here, what's needed for this person to be able to work through their trauma and then come out the other side of it and continue taking care of themselves, you know, to continue doing their work. So I think a compassion-informed approach is vital, really.
Yeah.
I think what that looks like in practical terms is different for different people. So some people might do like a full course of compassion-focused therapy, or they might do some sort of compassionate mind training, and that be a prerequisite to working then specifically on traumatic events, for example. Whereas for other people, that might be like weaved into other therapeutic approaches. But I think it has to be part of that like foundation, because I've never met a person in therapy who comes to therapy who is really great at being self-compassionate.
Yeah.
I just haven't. So there's gaps there.
Right. So it's building those skills first before you do the kind of really tough stuff. When you say trauma work, do you mean thinking about the memories and sort of going back in that sense and sort of processing it? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So when I say trauma work, I guess what I mean is like there are specific points in therapy where we might actively confront traumatic events.
Right.
So they might be overtly traumatic, big T trauma, we call them, don't we? The things that, are very overt and obviously traumatic. Or they might be what we call little T traumas, which are traumatic for that particular individual in their particular context. But I think there are points in therapy where you would actively confront those memories and do therapeutic work with them. And again, there's different ways to do that. And that, I guess, the way you do it would depend largely on what the goal is of focusing in on that particular event. And again, I think particularly I'm just thinking about people who've had these experiences where their emotional needs haven't been met, the value of entering into a therapeutic relationship where their emotional needs are kind of front and center. And being able to sort of test that out in a way that's safe, to explore it in a really open and honest way, to kind of experience being on the receiving end of validation and warmth and caring. I think that experience in of itself can be so reparative, can't it?
Absolutely. And what I found is, I think when someone eventually opens up to that experience in the work, there can then be almost like an outpouring of grief and loss when there's that realization that they didn't have anything close to that in their childhoods with their parents.
Yeah.
And then the work moves to that, and we tend to focus on that. Is that what you found in your work?
Yeah, there's a kind of, I feel like it's part of the process, isn't it? So when we acknowledge something that is painful, with that comes lots of difficult emotion. And I think sometimes like our human instinct is to back away from that because that's painful and it's uncomfortable. But it's such an important part of the process because actually, like, it's absolutely normal to feel sad about what you didn't have, to feel angry about, what was missing, whether things were intentional or unintentional. It doesn't really matter because those emotions that are coming up for people, that sadness, that anger, they're all valid. And I think to get through it, you've like got to go through those emotions, like, there's like a kid's book, like we're going on a bear hunt, can't go under it, can't go over it, got to go through it. And I feel like that's like what it is. Therapy is you can't go around it. Like you've got to go through it because those feelings belong there. They need to sort of be noticed and acknowledged and then settled down. You can't like just skip to that bit. Sometimes like we want the right answers from people, the apology, the acknowledgement, the closure. Like sometimes we feel like we need that from other people in order for us to be able to find some way of moving forward, I guess. And that would be lovely. And sometimes that happens. Certainly the people that I work with and have worked with, often that doesn't happen. And that's quite a painful thing to come to terms with. I think part of that healing journey is being able to recognize that there are people who can't give us certain things. There are people in our lives who are unable to meet our emotional needs for various reasons. And that brings hurt and it brings anger. But also, I think we can arrive at a point where we understand why they can't do that. Usually, a large portion of the time, it's through their own experiences and the choices that they're making, maybe not to work through that, but kind of being able to arrive at this idea that, this person or these people aren't able to meet my emotional needs. How else can I get my emotional needs met in other places? How can I maintain a relationship with these people who I want in my life, but it needs to be in a way where I'm not allowing their inability to meet my needs to hurt me anymore.
It's so hard, isn't it? It's so challenging because especially if you've got children yourself as well and there's a grandparent relationship that's there. And again, I think something that's really common is that you as an adult can see the relationship that your parents have with your children, and it looks completely different to the relationship that you had, and that can bring up quite a lot of pain as well. Actually, they're much better grandparents than they were parents to me. But navigating that. So it's navigating that hurt and that pain whilst also kind of having to come to a place of acceptance, isn't it? That's what you're saying. It's sort of accepting that it is how it is, and that's really hard.
Yeah. And I think acceptance isn't about saying that's okay. What happened or didn't happen is okay. It's more about recognizing that it is the circumstance that we're in. Probably none of us chose it, and kind of working within that to protect ourselves from future hurt. Like, I do think it's normal for people to, even when they reach like an acceptance of, these people can't meet my emotional needs, this is how I'm going to maintain this relationship, which is important to me, this is how I'm going to get my emotional needs met. Even then, it's still normal to kind of want that sometimes, to miss that, to think, oh gosh, wouldn't it just be lovely if this were different? Like, I think it's normal to still have those thoughts and feelings. Like, they don't go away.
And I think knowing that and normalizing that is really important. As human beings, we want to always move away from pain, don't we, as you mentioned earlier? And I think if you can name, actually, it's okay to feel like this, and you might always feel like this. That might sometimes come up for you, and that's okay, as long as you are, holding yourself with kindness around that feeling and seeking support and care from the people that give you support and care, then that's the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what would you say to someone listening? What would be your sort of tips around, someone has had the experience of childhood emotional neglect, perhaps they're not in therapy or not thinking about therapy, are there any tips that you could give us for someone like that?
Yeah. So tip number 1 would be like, just be gentle with yourself. Like, we're so harsh. Again, it's that thing, like our inner dialogues. We would not be speaking to other people out loud in the way that we speak to ourselves in here. So I think there is something, and I do this because it feels like a physical sort of like be gentle and cultivate that self-compassion.
Yeah.
Like, there's a sort of psychological holding of yourself, like taking care of, I think.
Yeah.
That's really, really important. And I think to do that, we need to create space. Like, that kind of gentle holding doesn't happen when we're running around at 20,000 miles an hour, day in, day out. Like, it needs space and time. So trying to sort of create that. Obviously, that's not achievable for everybody. People have busy lives and lots of commitments, but I think even just finding micro moments where you can just pause and check in with that, and check in with, how am I feeling? What do I need? How can I achieve that? What would I be saying to somebody else in this situation that I'm in? What would they need? How would I give that to them? I think that's really, really important. I think there's something else about beginning to like release any self-blame, any sense of, I didn't get this, or this happened to me because I'm bad, or it's my fault, or this must be something about me. I think releasing that, with that comes other emotions.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really important part of that process, is this idea that, we didn't choose the circumstances that we were born into. We didn't choose the family we were born into. We didn't choose the stuff that happened to our parents and to us. None of that's our fault. It's just the luck of the draw where you land. I think like there's a practical tip maybe around, like, we can relearn new ways of doing things. That we can skill ourselves up, or get support to skill ourselves up in the areas where we don't have the skill set, where we don't have the knowledge to know what to do with those difficult feelings. I think sometimes people are quite alone in this, like, that it's something to be embarrassed or ashamed about, that actually they can't control their anger. Like, they just blow up and it feels out of control, or they don't like to cry in front of people because they feel ashamed. But actually, if you start researching that, like there's loads of resources out there on the internet, various social channels and stuff, it's obviously the problem is rife because there's so much information out there on how to teach yourself, how to relearn, how to do the stuff that you didn't have.
Absolutely.
So I think, being gentle, releasing that self-blame, kind of learning those new skills. There's hope, isn't there? People can and do heal from this stuff. It takes time, though.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe it takes constant attention. Like, if you go to the gym and get your summer body and then you don't do anything for months and months, things will slip. And I think it's the same with this sort of psychological stuff. Like there needs to be like a maintenance. So then you need to find a way to build this stuff in so it becomes part of your life.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Shelley, for that. That was a really lovely conversation we had. We kind of meandered around lots of different things, didn't we? Thank you so much for coming on, Shelley. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hello Therapy. If you found it helpful, don't forget to subscribe, follow, and review. You can get more well-being and mental health tips by joining our email list and visiting the resources section of our website at harleyclinical.co.uk. The Hello Therapy podcast and the information provided by me, Dr. Liz White, is solely intended for information and educational purposes and does not constitute personalised advice. Please do reach out to your GP or a mental health professional if you need support. Until next time, take care of yourself.